there's a fairly large number of cults.
Really?
Well, there historically, California's been the world leader in cults for a very long time, and I would say that has not stopped, and that continues.
Did you know that the building that I bought for my comedy club initially was owned by a cult?
Fantastic.
It was owned by a cult from West Hollywood called the Buddha Field that migrated out to Austin when they were being investigated by the Cult Awareness Network.
God, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Are they gone or are they still there?
No, they're gone. There's a great documentary on it called Holy Hell.
Yeah.
You should watch it. It's pretty bonkers.
But they're from California.
From California.
The People's Temple, part of this great story of San Francisco is the People's Temple, which became famous for Jim Jones, where they killed everybody with poison Kool-Aid in the jungles in Guyana. That was a San Francisco cult for like a decade, right, before they went to the jungle. And everybody talks about the jungle. Nobody talks about the San Francisco part.
So are there a bunch that are running right now that are successful?
Big time. Yeah, totally.
Really?
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah.
Do you know them?
There's cults all over the place. I know a bunch of them, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
And how are they run?
Well, some of them are older. There's two sort of groupings. There's sort of 60s cults that are still kind of running.
Like which ones?
There's one called The Family in like Southern California that's still going from the 60s.
Really?
There's a bunch of them, running around. There was a big cult for a long time, sort of cult-ish kind of thing around, what was it? Not Erewhon, but Esalen. So there's still like that whole orbit.
That's the psychedelic groups.
All that stuff, yeah. That's from the 60s. And then there were a bunch of sort of tech cults in the 80s and 90s with names like the Extropians. There were a bunch of these guys. And then more recently, there's a lot of this. You'll hear these terms like rationalist, post-rationalist, effective altruism, existential risk. Long-termism, they sometimes say. And what you find is the people associated with these tend to be very smart. They tend to be very prolific. They tend to do a lot. Many of them are involved in tech, and then they end up with, let's say alternative living arrangements, alternative food and sex configurations, and lots of group-oriented, behavior. And it's like, what's the line, right? What's the line between what's the line between a social group that all lives together, that all has sex together, that all eats the same foods, that is not a cult, that engages in lots of it's like at some point they start to form belief systems that are not compatible with the outside world, and they start to kind of go in their own orbit.
Do they generally have a leader?
There are generally leaders. There is a pattern.
Yeah.
I think he talks about it in the book Chaos. There typically is a pattern. It's typically a guy.
Yeah.
There's typically there's a male female dynamic, right, that plays out inside these things that you kind of see over and over again. And so they often end up with more women than men. For mysterious reasons. And then there's usually some kind of leader. Although the other thing's happening now is a lot of modern cults, or kind of quasi cults. There'll be a physical component, but there's also an internet component now, right? And so the ideas will spread online, right? And so there'll kind of be members of the cult, or quasi members of the cult, or quasi members of the quasi cult that'll be online, and maybe at some point they actually come and physically join up. So, and by the way, let me say, like, generally I'm pro cult. Like, I'm actually quite pro cult. Well, it's the same reason I'm pro fringe, right? Which is like you're going to have if you're going to have people who are going to be thinking new things, they're going to tend to be these kinds of people. They're going to be people who are on the fringe. They're going to come together in groups. When they come together in groups, they're going to exhibit cult-like characteristics.
What you're saying resonates. Yeah. Everything you're saying makes sense. But how did you get to these conclusions? Like it seems that like accepting fringe and accepting the chaos of San Francisco, like, oh, this is good. This is a part of it. This is how this works. This is why it works. Yeah. Like, how did you develop that perspective?
Well, it's just, if you take a historical perspective, it's just like, okay, it's like, just an easy example. If you like rock music, it just basically modern rock and roll basically came from the Haight-Ashbury in the basically mid to late 60s, and then from Laurel Canyon, which was another one of these sort of cultish environments in the mid to late 60s. And there was like specific moments in time in both of these places. And, basically all of the great rock and roll from that era that determined everything that followed basically came out of this. So, do you want that or not?
Right.
Right. If you want it, that's what you get. I'll give you. Here's a crazy. There's the other book about Laurel Canyon that's even crazier than Chaos. It's the book called Weird Scenes in the Canyon. Oh, okay, you would love this one. So Laurel Canyon was like the Haight-Ashbury of Los Angeles, right? So Laurel Canyon was like the music scene, the sort of music and drug and hippie scene of Laurel Canyon is actually where the hippie movement started. There was actually a specific group in Laurel Canyon in L.A. in about 1965. There was a guy named Vito Polikas, and he had a group called the Freaks, and they were like a nonviolent version of the Manson cult, and it was all these young girls, and they basically would go to clubs, and they were the ones to do the beads and the hair and like all the leather, like all the hippie stuff. Like they got that rolling. And so like they were in Laurel Canyon, and in Laurel Canyon it was like ground zero. There was like this moment where it's like Jim Morrison, The Doors, and Crosby, Stills and Nash, and Frank Zappa, and was it John Phillips, was the Mamas and the Papas, and the Byrds, and the Monkees, and like all of these like iconic bands of that time basically catalyzed over about a 2-year period in Laurel Canyon. The conspiracy theory in this book basically is that the whole thing was an op, and it was a military intelligence op, and the evidence for the theory is that there was an Air Force military propaganda production facility at the head of Laurel Canyon called Lookout Mountain, which today Jared Leto owns and actually lives
so I was just going to say that.
Yeah, but it was in that era in the 50s through the 70s, it was a vertically integrated military. Yes, it was a production facility for film and music.
But by the way, have you met Jared Leto?
I briefly, yeah.
One of the most interesting guys I've ever talked to.
Incredible, and it makes total sense.
Totally normal, like really fun to talk to. Yeah. Not like what you would think of as a famous actor at all. Yeah. I had dinner with him and drinks. He's a fucking great guy.
But he lives in a military...
he showed me all the pictures. He showed me. I'm like, this is wild.
Yeah, so
it's amazing.
If you believe the moon landing was faked, this is where they faked it. Like this is.
I thought they'd supposed to do it in the Nevada desert.
No, these are the sound because they had sound stages. They had totally contained sound stages. They had full sound production capability. And so the theory goes basically. There were 3 parts to the conspiracy theory. So one is they had the production facility right there, right where all these musicians showed up. 2 is the musicians, like a very large percentage of these young musicians, were sons and daughters of senior U.S. military and intelligence officials. Including Jim Morrison, whose father was the head of naval operations for the Vietnam War at the time. And there were these other, I forget which ones, but there were these other musicians at the time where their parents were like senior in like military, like psychological operations. And like that's all real, like that's all documented. And then third is the head of the Rand Corporation, who was one of the inspirations for the Dr. Strangelove character in the movie. So he was the guy doing all the nuclear planning for nuclear war. He lived right in the heart of the hippies in Laurel Canyon.
Whoa.
In this famous house that's still there. And so the theory basically goes that the anti-war movement before the hippies was basically a square movement. It was all these basically young people, very clean cut. The men were all wearing, if you look at old like Vietnam War protests, like everybody's all like dressed up like they're going to a business meeting. It was like, and it was developing into a real threat. And so the theory is the hippie movement and rock and roll and the drug culture of the 60s was developed in order to basically sabotage the anti-war movement.
Wow.
Right.